From the outside looking in, Pastor Elijah Moore had it all: power, respect, and a devoted congregation that hung onto his every word. His sermons about love, faith, and fidelity filled the pews of his Houston megachurch every Sunday. To his followers, he was a righteous man of God, a pillar of the community. But behind closed doors, Elijah was a man of secrets. He had just married Naomi Carter, a stunning, soft-spoken woman who had won the hearts of the churchgoers almost as quickly as she had captured Elijah's. The wedding was a grand affair, held in the church's lavish hall, with chandeliers casting golden light over the hundreds of guests who had come to witness the holy union. The congregation cheered as the pastor kissed his bride. It was a picture-perfect moment. Yet Naomi's hands were trembling. Her smile was forced. She knew something no one else did. Something that, if exposed, would shatter everything Elijah had built. That night, in their honeymoon suite at the St. Regis Hotel, the illusion of perfection cracked. Elijah had been distant all evening, his grip on Naomi's hand tightening whenever someone complimented her beauty. As soon as the suite door clicked shut behind them, his demeanor shifted. "You were awfully friendly with Deacon Russell tonight," he muttered, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. Laughing, touching his arm. "I don't like that." Naomi froze, her stomach twisting. "Elijah, I was just being polite." His lips curled into something that was neither a smile nor a frown. "Polite," he echoed. "You want to know what else I don't like?" He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes boring into her. "Secrets." Her heart pounded. Did he know? What are you talking about?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. He placed his glass down, walked toward her, and brushed his fingers across her cheek, so gentle it made her skin crawl. "You see, my dear," he whispered, "I did a little digging before the wedding." Naomi's breath hitched. He knew. And that meant she was in danger. Elijah pulled a manila envelope from the inside pocket of his suit. With deliberate slowness, he tossed it onto the bed in front of her. Naomi hesitated before picking it up. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Photos. Documents. Evidence. Her past, the one she thought she had buried, laid out before her in crisp black and white. "You thought you could fool me, Naomi?" His voice was almost amused, but his eyes were dark with something else. "You thought you could stand at the altar of God with me, knowing what you've done?" Naomi clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe. "It's not what you think," she said, though she knew it wouldn't matter. Elijah chuckled, a low and sinister sound. "Oh, really? Because what I think is that my new wife has been keeping a rather interesting secret about her real past. Not the sweet, innocent woman of God she pretends to be." Her pulse thundered in her ears. She had no way out. He moved closer. "Tell me, Naomi. How does a woman with your history get to stand before the Lord and take me as her husband?" Naomi swallowed hard. She had spent years outrunning this, rebuilding herself into a woman of faith, trying to leave the past behind. But the past never really stays buried, does it? "Elijah, please," she whispered. "I never meant to lie to you." "But you did." His expression darkened. "And that means you don't deserve me. You don't deserve the life I've given you." And then, before she could react, his hands were around her throat. Naomi gasped, her fingers clawing at his iron grip. "Elijah," she choked, her vision dimming. "God doesn't forgive liars," he hissed. "And neither do I." Darkness crept at the edges of her vision. She struggled, her hands flailing, knocking over the whiskey glass. The sound of shattering crystal barely registered. Then, a deafening bang. The force sent Elijah stumbling backward, eyes wide in shock. Naomi collapsed onto the floor, coughing, sucking in air. And in his chest, right where his heart should be, was a blooming red stain. The gun was still smoking in Naomi's trembling hand. She had grabbed it from the nightstand in a blind panic, barely aware of pulling the trigger. Elijah staggered, eyes full of disbelief, then collapsed onto the bed, his breathing ragged. Naomi's hands were slick with sweat and blood as she scrambled backward. He was dying. But he wasn't dead yet. With a weak, gurgling breath, Elijah's lips curled into a chilling smile. "You think this is over?" he rasped, his voice full of something that sent ice through her veins. Naomi didn't answer. She stood there, frozen, watching the life drain from the man she had just married. Then she heard it. A faint knock on the door. Her breath caught in her throat. And then, another knock. And a voice. Deep. Commanding. Familiar. "Naomi, open the door." Her blood ran cold. She knew that voice. Knew it too well. Because the man standing outside the door. was supposed to be dead. Naomi's breath came in short, panicked gasps as the knocks on the hotel room door grew louder. "Naomi, open the door." The voice was deep, commanding, unmistakable. She staggered backward, her fingers still trembling around the gun. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she turned toward the bleeding man on the bed. Elijah's eyes were glazed, his lips pale, his chest rising and falling in weak, uneven breaths. He was barely holding on. He's supposed to be dead. The thought repeated over and over in her mind like a broken record. She turned back toward the door, her body frozen in place. "Naomi, I know you're in there." She knew that voice. It belonged to a man she had loved. A man she had mourned. A man she had buried. But that was impossible. Because Elijah had told her himself. He's dead, Naomi. He's never coming back. She swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight, as if invisible fingers were still wrapped around it from Elijah's near-fatal attack. Her mind raced. She had two choices: open the door and face whoever, or whatever, was standing outside, or stay locked in the room with her dying husband and the undeniable proof that she had just shot him. The knocking stopped. A long silence stretched through the air, thick with tension. Then, the doorknob turned. Naomi's stomach dropped. The door swung open. And there he was. Marcus Carter. Her first love. Her dead fiancé. The man she had watched be lowered into the ground 5 years ago. Naomi felt the room tilt. Her legs went weak beneath her. She grabbed the edge of the dresser to steady herself, but her head was spinning. He looked exactly the same. The same sharp jawline, the same piercing dark eyes that had once looked at her with love. He wore a fitted black suit, crisp, clean, like he had just stepped out of a luxury car. But his presence was wrong. He wasn't supposed to be here. Her voice cracked. You're supposed to be dead. Marcus tilted his head, as if amused. You really believe that? His lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. Oh, Naomi, there's so much you don't know. Her heart pounded against her ribs. How are you here? She whispered. He took a step inside, closing the door behind him. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. Because, sweetheart. He gestured toward Elijah's bleeding body on the bed. Your husband and I? We have unfinished business. Naomi's head snapped toward Elijah. His eyelids fluttered weakly, his breathing ragged, but the moment he heard Marcus's voice, something changed. His entire body stiffened. His fingers twitched. His eyes, clouded with pain, slowly opened. And then, for the first time since she had shot him, Elijah Moore laughed. A low, broken chuckle, filled with something terrifying. Naomi's blood turned to ice. Elijah's lips parted, and he whispered through his labored breath. You have no idea what you've just done. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, but I do. He walked toward the bed, his presence looming over Elijah like a shadow. You thought you could kill me, bury me, and take everything that belonged to me. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. Wait, what are you talking about? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Marcus turned toward her, eyes gleaming. You really don't know, do you? She shook her head, heart hammering. Marcus sighed, rubbing his jaw. Elijah didn't just find those secrets about your past, Naomi. He created them. Her stomach twisted. What? Elijah coughed, a weak smirk playing on his blooded lips. Tell her, Marcus, he rasped. Tell her the truth. Marcus took another step forward, lowering his voice. The truth, Naomi? You never really knew the man you married. His eyes darkened. Just like you never really knew the man you were supposed to marry. Her breath caught. Marcus, what are you saying? I'm saying. He turned his attention back to Elijah. You weren't the only one playing a game, sweetheart. Naomi's hands clenched into fists. No, that doesn't make sense. You were dead. Elijah showed me the police reports. The autopsy. Marcus let out a low laugh. Autopsy? That's cute. You saw what Elijah wanted you to see. The walls felt like they were closing in. She had spent years grieving Marcus. Years. She had spent years thinking she had finally found a new life with Elijah. And now she was standing in a hotel room, her husband bleeding out on the bed, while the man she had once loved, the man she had thought was dead, was staring at her with something dark in his eyes. You never asked the right questions, Naomi, Marcus murmured, stepping closer. You never stopped to wonder why Elijah was so eager to marry you. Why he made sure you never looked into my death yourself. Her breath hitched. because deep down, she had wondered. She had just been too afraid to ask. Elijah lied to you, Marcus continued, his voice calm, smooth, hypnotic. He took everything from me. He stole my life, my church, my wife. His gaze burned into hers. And now? The tables have turned. Naomi felt her knees go weak. Nothing made sense. Nothing felt real. And then, Elijah moved. It was slow, painful, but his body shifted. His hand reached toward the nightstand. Naomi's eyes widened. The gun. Elijah's fingers wrapped around the handle. Marcus didn't see. Naomi did. And in that split second, she had to choose. Naomi's entire body tensed. Elijah's blooded fingers wrapped around the gun on the nightstand. His movements were sluggish, but his determination was clear. Marcus didn't see. But Naomi did. Her heart pounded like a war drum. Do something. Marcus was still speaking, his voice thick with venom as he towered over Elijah. You spent years living my life. Wearing my name like a suit. You thought you won. But you forgot one thing, brother. Elijah's hand jerked toward him, the gun trembling in his grip. Naomi moved. She lunged, grabbing Elijah's wrist just as his fingers squeezed the trigger. Bang! The gunshot exploded in the small hotel room. Glass shattered. The mirror behind Marcus burst into shards, raining across the floor like falling knives. Marcus ducked, his body twisting away from the bullet's path. Elijah groaned in pain, his weakened body failing him. Naomi wrenched the gun from his grasp and threw it across the room. It clattered to the floor near the dresser. Elijah's chest rose and fell in ragged gasps. Blood smeared across the white sheets beneath him. His smirk returned, but it was weak. Fading. You should have let me finish this, he croaked. Marcus straightened, brushing glass from his suit, his eyes burning with something dark. You never were much of a shooter, he muttered, shaking his head. Naomi took a step back, her breath shaky. Somebody needs to start talking, she said. Right now. Marcus tilted his head. Oh, Naomi, you still don't get it, do you? He turned his piercing gaze toward her. Your husband, he spat the word like it was poison, wasn't just my enemy. He was my executioner. Naomi felt the ground beneath her slip. What? Marcus exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw. The night I died. Elijah set me up. He made sure I disappeared, made sure the world believed I was gone. But he wasn't planning to kill me outright. No, that would have been too easy. Elijah chuckled weakly from the bed, his voice hoarse. You were always soft, Marcus. He coughed, his smirk barely holding. I was doing you a favor. Marcus's jaw tensed. Naomi could barely breathe. You knew he was alive, she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Elijah licked his cracked lips. Knew? He turned his head toward her, his bloodshot eyes glinting with amusement. Sweetheart. I made him suffer every single day. Naomi's stomach dropped. Marcus's hands clenched into fists. You locked me away, Marcus said, his voice low, dangerous. Had me beaten, tortured. Stole my identity. Took everything I built. Naomi shook her head, her mind spinning. That's not possible, she whispered. That doesn't make sense. Elijah chuckled again, but it was weaker this time. Doesn't it? He licked his lips, his voice rasping. And yet, here we are. Naomi's breathing grew erratic. She needed truth. She needed something to make sense. Her voice trembled as she asked, why? Elijah's eyes flickered toward her, then toward Marcus. His smile was almost amused. Because, he said slowly, I was always the better man. Marcus's fist flew. It collided with Elijah's jaw, snapping his head back. The bed frame groaned under the impact. Blood splattered across the pillow. Naomi gasped, stepping back as Marcus grabbed Elijah by the collar, dragging him closer. You stole my life, Marcus hissed, his face inches from Elijah's. My church. My legacy. And you thought you could just get away with it. Elijah's mouth twisted into a bloody grin. I almost did. Marcus's grip tightened, his knuckles white. Naomi's pulse was wild. The rage in Marcus's face, it was unhinged. Marcus, she whispered, but he didn't hear her. Elijah laughed, spitting blood onto the sheets. What's the matter, old friend? Still afraid to finish what you started? Marcus's hand clamped around his throat. Naomi froze. The air in the room changed. Elijah's body jerked beneath Marcus's grip. His hands clawed weakly at Marcus's wrist, but he was too weak. Marcus's face was unreadable. Elijah's eyes, once burning with arrogance, widened. He struggled, a gurgling sound escaping his throat. Naomi's stomach turned. Marcus. She grabbed his arm, trying to pull him away. Stop. He's dying. Marcus didn't let go. Elijah's body convulsed. His lips parted. His eyes fluttered. Then, bam. The hotel room door exploded inward. Armed officers flooded in, guns drawn. Marcus released Elijah immediately, his hands flying up in surrender. Naomi stumbled back, shocked. Officers swarmed the room, their weapons trained on Marcus. Two of them rushed to the bedside, checking Elijah's pulse. He's alive, one of them confirmed. Barely. A tall man in a black suit stepped forward. Detective Harris. Naomi recognized him immediately. His sharp eyes flicked between Marcus, Elijah, and the wrecked room. Then they landed on her. Naomi Moore. His voice was cool, authoritative. She swallowed hard. Why yes. He exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. You're under arrest. Her heart stopped. What? She whispered. Detective Harris motioned toward his partner. Cuff her. Cold metal clamped around her wrists before she could breathe. Her mind spun. Wait, she cried. What's happening? Why am I being arrested? Harris's eyes were stone cold. For the attempted murder of your husband, Elijah Moore, he said. Naomi's blood ran cold. The room blurred. Her breath came too fast. No, she whispered. No, you don't understand. Save it, Harris cut her off. You have the right to remain silent. The words rattled in her skull. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be real. She turned, eyes wide, desperate. Marcus was gone. Naomi sat in the cold interrogation room, her wrists aching from the tight cuffs. The flickering fluorescent light above cast sharp shadows across the gray walls. She had stopped crying hours ago, if she had even cried at all. Her mind was a storm. She had walked into this marriage blind, believing she had found a man of God, a leader, a protector. Instead, she had become tangled in a war between two devils, and now, she was paying the price. The metal door creaked open. Detective Harris stepped inside, tossing a thick manila folder onto the table. He pulled out a chair, sitting across from her with an expression she couldn't read. You've got a hell of a mess on your hands, Naomi, he said, flipping open the folder. She clenched her jaw. I didn't try to kill my husband. Harris smirked, tapping his pen on the table. Funny. Your fingerprints were on the gun. And a bullet was fired. One aimed directly at Marcus Black. Naomi's stomach twisted. I didn't shoot at him. Elijah grabbed the gun, I tried to stop him. Convenient, Harris said, tilting his head. But let's talk about motive. We both know Elijah Moore is a fraud. You must have figured that out before you walked down the aisle. Did you plan to kill him all along? Naomi's blood boiled. She leaned forward, her cuffed hands pressing against the table. I am not a killer. Harris raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Then why did Marcus Black flee the scene? She froze. He didn't flee, she stammered. The police barged in, there was chaos. Marcus Black is a ghost, Naomi. Harris's voice turned sharp. He doesn't exist in our records. No ID. No birth certificate. The only Marcus Black we do have on file is dead. Buried. Been that way for 10 years. A chill ran down her spine. So tell me, Harris continued, his eyes narrowing, who the hell were you protecting? Naomi opened her mouth, then closed it. Who was Marcus? What if she had been wrong about him? Before she could speak, the door swung open again. Another officer stepped inside and whispered something into Harris's ear. Harris's eyebrows shot up. Then, without another word, he stood and left the room. Naomi sat there, her pulse pounding, her mind racing. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Then the door opened again. Elijah Moore walked in. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. He looked like a corpse. His face was bandaged, his lips split. His left arm was in a sling, and his right hand was wrapped in gauze. Yet, despite his injuries, the smirk on his face was intact. Hello, wife, he said, sitting across from her. Naomi's stomach churned. Get out, she spat. He ignored her. You must be wondering how I'm still breathing. God's mercy, maybe? He chuckled, shaking his head. Nah. More like my insurance policy. Naomi's body went rigid. He leaned in, his eyes gleaming. See, while you were busy playing house, I made sure to cover my tracks. Told the police everything. How you tried to shoot me. How you planned to kill me for my money. Naomi's hands trembled in the cuffs. You're lying. Elijah grinned. Am I? He leaned back, feigning exhaustion. I told them how you found out about my past, how you conspired with that imposter, Marcus, or whatever the hell he calls himself, to get rid of me. Naomi's head spun. This wasn't happening. He was framing her. And the worst part? He was winning. Elijah sighed, tapping his bandaged fingers on the table. They believe me, Naomi. The evidence? The gun? The fact that you were caught in the room? It all lines up. Naomi's heart pounded. Why are you doing this? She whispered. You know I didn't try to kill you. Elijah's expression darkened. Because I refused to lose. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with something primal. You think I built all this just to let you and some ghost from my past take it away? He scoffed. No, darling. I worked too hard for this life. I crawled out of hell to get here. You? You're just a casualty. Naomi shook her head, disbelief washing over her. This was the man she married? This was the man she almost gave her life to? Elijah's smirk returned. The trial will be quick. You'll be found guilty, sent away for a long, long time. And me? He shrugged, feigning sympathy. I'll be the grieving husband. The victim. The man who barely survived his wife's betrayal. Naomi's chest ached. It was over. She was trapped. A slow tear slid down her cheek, but she refused to let her face crumble. Elijah stood up, adjusting his sling. Goodbye, Naomi. The door opened. A guard stepped in to escort him out. But then, before he could leave, a commotion erupted outside. Shouting. A loud bang. The guard reached for his radio. What's going on? The next moment, the door slammed open. And in walked Marcus Black. Naomi's breath caught. Elijah stiffened. Marcus was calm. Too calm. His suit was pristine. His hands were in his pockets. His eyes, however, they were ice cold. The officers behind him looked uncertain, as if they had just watched something impossible unfold. Marcus's lips curled into a smirk. I believe we have some unfinished business, he said smoothly. Elijah's face drained of color. And then, bang. The sound of a gunshot echoed from the hallway. Then, screams. Officers rushed out, chaos erupting beyond the door. Marcus turned his head slightly, listening. Then, with a satisfied smirk, he looked back at Elijah. That would be your security detail, Marcus said, his voice dangerously soft. You should have chosen better men. Elijah froze. Naomi's heart slammed against her ribs. Marcus took a step forward. You thought you could bury me, he murmured. Erase me. Rewrite history. Elijah swallowed hard. But let me tell you something, old friend, Marcus's smirk widened. The dead don't stay buried for long. Elijah's eyes darted toward the officers. His breathing turned ragged. Panic. Real panic. Marcus leaned in close. And now, he whispered, it's your turn. Elijah's lips parted, but before he could speak. More gunshots. More screams. Then, the power cut out. The room plunged into darkness. And the last thing Naomi heard before the world descended into chaos was Marcus's laughter.